Thank you so much to those of you who are on time. We're going to get started right on time because, as I said, this is recorded. Of course, I am so excited. Thank you, Adama, for your thank you in the chat. I'm so excited to spend time with you all. I'm really, really excited this Black August. I feel like this Black August feels more Black Augusty than any Black August has ever felt before. And for those who have never commemorated this time, I am really, really excited that you're here to learn a little bit more of the stories and the groundings that keep me hopeful and optimistic and looking forward to the new world that we're creating. And so I will invite folks, if you're comfortable, if you're willing, to introduce yourselves in the chat, and you can share as much or as little information as you'd like. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen with you all. You're at the right place if you're here for Black August, a WTF Safety Net webinar series. And I am Dania Davy, for those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet as yet. I am the founder of Land and Liberation. I'm the proud mom of an 11-year-old, newly minted sixth grader as of yesterday, and I'm the attorney, author, and activist behind Land and Liberation, LLC, where I help humans connect with the natural and financial resources to help support their stewardship of the land. My career has predominantly been in service of Black farmers in the US Southeast. And from that history, I started the WTF, We're the Future. It also means the other thing that everyone thought it meant the whole time. But WTF is just a community of support for folks who want to stay updated on what's going on with the political climate and especially how that impacts our small scale farmers and land stewards. And if you haven't already registered for the newsletter, there's a website. This is one of the webinars and many other topics that are put out. And I'm also on tour across the country as I prepare to return back to Jamaica. It's partially a farewell tour and partially helping form and support and get financial resources to small scale producers and their communities in the effort towards their mutual aid and solidarity economies. So, what does Black August have to do with WTF? And so, first of all, there are folks that are on here that might not know what Black August is. There might be folks that have heard of Black History Month, and so you're kind of like, okay, Black is in it, August in it, so it probably has some things to do with history. And Black August was actually started in the prison industrial complex, and during Black August, it's a time where we honor the wisdom of Black political prisoners, freedom fighters, and the revolutionaries who sacrificed their freedoms for our liberation from colonization, racial capitalism, imperialism, and of course, the prison industrial complex. And this is a month where there are a lot of significant historical revolutionary moments. And so I'm not going to go through the laundry list of all of those occurrences, but August is a month that lots of folks spend this time. Some folks fast. It's a time for study, reflection, really sharpening our tools and our toolboxes for the new world that we're all building together. And so, what does that have to do with WTF? Well, as I reference a lot on WTF, our movements for food justice, land justice, and environmental justice, they have roots. They have very deep roots. We're not the first. We are actually the legacy of lots of liberationists, radicals, and revolutionaries who came before us. And without their commitment to liberation for all, we really would not have the movements that we've inherited. So I think it's really important for us to remember, especially during the times when the news is really, really triggering our anxiety, our central nervous system, just remembering that there are ancestors and also imprisoned political prisoners who have shared this vision that we all share for a world in which we're all liberated. That brings me personally a lot of comfort and peace. And as Angela Davis, one of the most famous Black revolutionaries of this country, states, radical simply means grasping things at the root. And I think that in my work with farmers and understanding the history of the civil rights movement and the Black cooperative development movements, it's almost impossible to remove this parallel of the ways in which all of these systems, all of these institutions, whether it's USDA or the prison industrial complex or the privatized concentration camps for immigrants, we're all freedom fighters. And the threads of anti-Blackness, anti-immigrant sentiment, and white supremacy and imperialism, those are the root causes of so many of the disparate outcomes that we and the people and communities that we care about experience. And so I wanted to share, because Black August is rooted in the prison liberation movement, that the Jericho movement has created a map that lists many of the prisoners and fallen freedom fighters. And also Hammer and Hope has a really, really, really good article that's called Why We Work to Free Political Prisoners of the Black Power Era. And so I'm not going to go through the long list, but I will invite you in your own time, or even when we're going to have a couple of breaks for reflection during this webinar, to look at some of those names. You might recognize some of those names. Some have recently, in the past 4 years, been liberated. And so I just wanted to point you towards some resources where you can find some names, some of the peoples that this movement is really grounded in and for. In today's session, we're going to examine the radical origins of the United States domestic nutrition programs, the roots in the Southern civil rights and Black nationalist movements. And it's really, really important to me as a person who's worked with Black farmers in the South, who got bitten by the bug of doing this work in Mississippi, to call up Fannie Lou Hamer. And as she said, nobody's free until everybody's free. And another really, really great quote. This is a longer one, but this is something that I think about so often. The food we eat masks so much cruelty. The fact that we can sit down and eat a piece of chicken without thinking about the horrendous conditions under which chickens are industrially bred in this country is a sign of the dangers of capitalism, how capitalism has colonized our minds. The fact that we look no further than the commodity itself, the fact that we refuse to understand the relationships that underlie the commodities that we use on a daily basis. And that's how Black August is connected to our movements, the ways in which the commodification of the food products that we have access to and the nutrition programs of this government in and of themselves create further health inequities and wealth disparities between the communities as a byproduct of imperialism. And so I wanted to go back. We had a Friday session where lots of folks felt like it was really helpful. And I've always given the warning that I'm a nerd and I teach a critical race theory in the food system course. And when I was in law school, one of the essays I wrote was about why we need a new constitution. So, as a nerd who has spent a lot of time thinking about, one of the first industries in this country, agriculture, and thinking about the policies that are relatively recent, and that's one of the powers that I think we have in this moment as revolutionaries. So much of the heavy lifting that we need for this moment, we're actually like standing on the shoulders of folks that did a lot of that really, really difficult work. And so now all we have to really do is be really good students of our revolutionary ancestors, and not just ancestors, those are that are still living today, that really understood how to address institutional inequities, and just recognizing that we don't have to go all the way back to the to origins of human history to realize that these policies are relatively recent in time. And so for me, even though they feel really entrenched, even though they feel that they can't change, even though they feel like the lobbyists have, everything all sealed up, I really like to look at the first Farm Bill as a time when the federal government really recognized. So we put it in the context of the Great Depression. So nationwide hunger, nationwide poverty, nationwide suffering, and the government recognized that if there were not policies that were going to address income for farmers, stabilizing farm income, then it was going to be near impossible to keep the entire country afloat. And what does afloat mean within the context of racial capitalism? So it's all also really important to remember that the imagination of what they thought they could build was definitely constrained by what their goal was to maintain status quo. And so we have the benefit of we're not constrained by that, right? We've seen, in 2025, we've seen that neoliberalism, racial capitalism have completely failed. The Mother Earth is telling us that. Pandemics are telling us that. Increasing wars, increasing natural disasters, the proliferation of authoritarian states around the country are telling us that these so-called, neoliberal values that we've been indoctrinated with, they're not timeless. They're time limited and their time is up. And the during the Great Depression, FDR and the entire New Deal was an attempt to prevail an American democracy and put policy into place that fundamentally addressed the needs of farmers. So the first Farm Bill, as it's referred to now, there was a statute that called for farmers to enter into agreements with the Secretary of Agriculture to reduce their acreage in 7 basic commodities: wheat, cotton, corn, rice, tobacco, hogs, and milk in return for federal benefit. And those payments would be derived from taxes levied at processing. So why were those commodities chosen? That's a really good question. And I think that's a question for us to continue to ask when we take for granted that the commodification of nature is a relatively recent human development. And so there was no like pre-existing like wheat is a commodity that is going to be subsidized by the government. This was completely created in the 1930s. And it's important to notice that there were a very, very limited list of things that were going to be subsidized by the government. And why were they trying to reduce the acreage? Keep that question in mind. So to account for the regional variation in pricing and production of those commodities, there would be county commodity committees that would set the base acreage and the annual allotment and compliance for each farm. So some of you have heard about the Pigford lawsuit. So one of the things that came about during the documentation of evidence of race-based discrimination at the local level by USDA was that these county committees had, pretty much all white men who were also farmers in their communities, who were set in place to make sure that there was, locally responsive decision making with regard to the price of a particular commodity. But when folks are given that much power and they have racial animus behind it, then you can see how very quickly it can become exclusionary towards non-white farmers who were not and continue to this day to be underrepresented on those county committees. Now, for the answer to the question of why were they trying to reduce the amount of acreage, the reality was that we had an overproduction problem. There were so many people that were growing their own food. There were so many farmers that were producing that they were going to flood the markets. Like the prices of these things that if you grow them, in subsistence quantities, then, there's not much of a capitalist income that can be generated because if everyone is producing it, then the demand decreases. Those economics principles. The more product that there is, the lower the price. And so by trying to restrict the amount of production, the government's original idea was restricting the amount of production would increase or at least stabilize the value or the price that the farmer would receive for these commodities. And I'm not going to go through every single one, but I just wanted to show that throughout the 30s, it varied. There weren't always the same commodities. And I like to reflect back on this when folks are like, it has to be like we cannot have crop insurance for vegetables, or we cannot have bees as a part of a cash flow farm loan, right? So like when we hear these explanations of why there's certain products that we want to grow to feed the people in our communities and not to be further processed for distribution programs, we have evidence that the government has made adjustments to what were subsidized, even from the very beginning of these programs. And so part of the issue with that original set of commodities programs was that there still was a lot of hunger in this country, and you're telling farmers to grow less food. And there were times where, the government was like buying hogs and slaughtering them and like, draining milk and like and destroying crops because they were trying to stabilize the price for these products. And so the optics of having the federal government actively destroying food while there were hundreds of thousands of people in this country that were literally starving and depending on what their local farmers could produce, the government pivoted and realized, okay, we have to switch from controlling the production to manufacturing demand. And that is part of the birth. I know that there's other more romantic tellings of this. I think there's other ways that this story gets relayed. But part of the founding of these nutrition programs are really closely connected to control and manufacture demand. So this is obviously a very abbreviated timeline, but I wanted to show that from 1778, like the federal government was entering into treaties with tribal nations and replacing their sovereign food production, destroying their buffalo, destroying their crops, and replacing their food sovereignty, their seed sovereignty, their land sovereignty with surplus commodity and rations programs. And when we do go into Black August, a session specifically about food insecurity of Afro-Indigenous peoples, I'll go a little bit deeper into that history, but just suffice it to say that this controlling production and manufacturing demand is part and parcel of our food system. Also in 1933, the Federal Surplus Relief Corporation was chartered. And then the very first test or pilot of a food stamp program was initiated in 1939. And I wanted to call out that in 1943, the government said, we actually don't need food stamps anymore because the conditions that created the need for a food stamp program, they're all resolved. So it just was so funny to me to reflect on that in the same way that socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers definition is being attacked by this administration, they both use the same language that the conditions no longer exist. So there was no more poverty. There was no more impact from the Great Depression by 1943, like hunger, check. Like but from very early on, the federal government recognized that there needed to be programs put in place to subsidize access to food for the most vulnerable communities in this nation. In 1954, this is another one of the manufactured demand programs. The Agricultural Trade Development and Assistance Act created the Food for Peace program, and Food for Peace is a part of national defense. So we overproduce food and we dump it onto the markets of other nations to make friends and to keep their agricultural product prices diminished. Of course not. Like it's all good-hearted, like good, Democrat behavior. But that's one of the demands for the surplus commodities. There are a variety of supplemental food programs that came into existence in the 1970s, one of the most significant of which was the Food Distribution Program on Indian reservations, and then by 1983, the Emergency Food Assistance Program. So all of these programs, the Commodity Supplemental Food Program today is very closely connected to senior access to 60 and over people for commodities, and some of these programs have evolved to include processed foods. But I just wanted to show that when the government realized that controlling production was going to be bad optics, they created demand. And so the first reflection question, because this is a webinar, so you have to do some work. The first reflection question, you saw the list of the commodities. Do any federal nutrition programs align with my ancestral foodways? So you saw the lists, you saw what they are. I want you to just spend a few minutes reflecting on whether any of the federal nutrition programs, the actual commodities that are subsidized by our government, do those align with your ancestral foodways, the foods that your ancestors would have grown, prepared, eaten as a part of their cultural practices? I'm going to give you a few minutes to reflect on that. So I hope you had a chance to really think about the realities of the disconnect that these programs create for the families that rely on them between, for the most part, their ancestral foodways and food norms. One that stands out to me, and I recently was reminded when I was reading, oh, and now I'm not going to remember the name of the book. I was reading a book about Indigenous Americans' history and food inequities, and they were talking about how they're like no people of color can digest milk, like like African Americans, Asian Americans, like we do not have the gut, the intestinal biomes for digesting milk, and yet that's one of the commodities. So just something to think about, um, and we'll go back to the presentation. Okay. So now that we kind of understand some of the legal framework in which the nutrition programs, the commodity programs were rooted, I wanted to uplift this really awesome story. I hope a lot of people know this story. I hope this is going to be like super boring. I hope everyone knows this story. And in the off chance that this is new to folks, the Greenwood blockade is one of those like landmark moments in defining what we have inherited and consider the food justice movement. So, food justice is something that is definitely hyper localized, and different communities have their own origin story. But in terms of how we think of the food justice movement as a whole, one of the first, landmark moments occurred in Ruleville, Mississippi, home of civil rights farmer icon Fannie Lou Hamer. And as I went through the various nutrition programs, the Federal Surplus Food Commodity Program was one of those nutrition programs. This one was one that provided food for sharecroppers and farm workers. So in between seasons, sharecroppers and farm workers, their source of income was connected to, the agricultural system. And so there were over 20,000 sharecroppers and farm workers in Ruleville, Mississippi, that depended on this program for their food. Like their their options were limited for how they could access food. And around, late 50s, early 60s, we know that SNCC was in that area, and they were engaging the local community. And a lot of farmers, we know this history for civil rights. We know that Black farmers were very active in the movement for civil rights. And so the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors was not feeling the fact that some of these, sharecroppers and farm workers were like becoming registered voters. And, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, we know that the land that the training center is on is a part of that land was purchased by sharecroppers. And what was happening was that sharecroppers were trying to purchase land. They were coming together, in that instance, the Panola Land Buyers Association. They were coming together, saving their resources, buying land so that they could grow their own food. And then on top of that, they were becoming registered voters. And so the white citizens of LaFleur County were like, we have to put an end to this. I do think it's interesting to note, though, that it wasn't a landslide vote. I should have put the numbers, but it was something like 40 to 28. And I like to lift that up. I know for some folks it's like, oh, well, but they voted to do it. But I think it's important to remember that justice has always been finding its way to us. And that's part of the legacy that we're inheriting as well. And so SNCC, in response to the termination of the funding for the Federal Surplus Food Commodity Program, they started organizing. They did their thing. So they organized what's now considered the first food justice campaign. They petitioned the president. They were writing the Secretary of Ag. They were not leaving any stones unturned. They even testified in front of the House Judiciary Committee, and they were letting everyone know that the LaFleur County Board of Supervisors, they knew how vulnerable the farm workers and sharecroppers were, and they were intentionally trying to starve them. They were intentionally withholding food as an act of genocide. And so by bringing attention, by bringing advocacy, by being organized, and as a result of SNCC's work, the federal government basically reached out to LaFleur County Board of Supervisors and was like, look, if you don't reinstate this program, we're going to have the USDA at the federal level run this program for you. And for those of you who don't spend your time in the South, they really do not like the federal government getting involved in running their programs down here. And so they immediately like chickened out, they backed down, and they reinstated the program. And so I just love this story. I love that it's in Mississippi because I have deep love and roots with the movement in Mississippi. And also just thinking about SNCC, thinking about the intergenerational component, thinking about the sharecroppers who were doing what they could, the farm workers and sharecroppers. This is where all of this like beautiful democracy on the local level and folks were really engaged in organizing. And because of that, they did all of the things. They didn't just do a local campaign for their state. They brought in the federal government. They were willing to go all the way up to DC and testify in front of the House Judiciary Committee. And that's part of what we've inherited too. And that's why I'm really excited about this story because we can use all of those tactics, even though many of us feel like it's been tried before, it's been tried before, it's been tried under different conditions. It's been tried under different conditions. And they were prepping the ground, and now we have a different fertile ground to plant our intentions and to implant our labor. And so it's really important for us to remember that you might not have known this story. You might not know that you're standing on the shoulders of giants, but just remember that as a person who's a part of the food justice movement, the civil rights movement, the movements towards liberation, this is a part of the ancestry that you're a steward of. And so it's our responsibility to be good descendants of these ancestors and carry their work forward. So I wanted to invite you to reflect. And that story, brings me a lot of joy and is one that we can return to. And yet and still, it's like, do we really have to do all of the things? Like there's a lot of things. Like there's a lot of things happening. Um, there were a lot of similar, there was war, there were protests, there were a lot of similar, political circumstances at that time. But I get it. I know that with technology and with all of the ways in which our attentions are being colonized by all of these technology devices, it is much harder for us than it was for us to prioritize. I mean, things do not necessarily feel as life and death for each of us individually as they did for our ancestors. And so when things are life or death, you don't have analysis paralysis, you just go. Whereas for us, we have the time, we have the spaciousness of time, we have the spaciousness of all of the education that all of us have received, whether through institutions or through the education of learning these lessons from those who've come before us. And so I think it's really helpful that we become very disciplined about thinking about our personal self-determination, right? Like you have a limited capacity and none of us can do every single thing, but we can all do something and we can all do something in our own ways and in our own timing. And so I want you to spend a few minutes and asking yourself, what are the factors that can help you determine your personal role? And this is in, weighing these two things. So one is organizing your communities around reinstating existing federal government programs versus creating new values-based models. So both of those things we all know are happening in this moment. They're all happening concurrently, but we all have limited human capacity. So what are some of those factors that can help you determine like which of those gets your primary attention? Is it that you split your focus? Is it that you put it all in one place and partner with others that are doing the other thing? But I want you to spend a few minutes reflecting on that, and then we'll come back together. And we're back, and I responded to a question that came in through the Q&A box. Someone asked a really good question. Why did the government need to create a corporation to administer the programs? And the short answer is that after the president basically created some of these agencies through executive order, and then the laws were sorry, Della. Della, you always crack me up in the chat. Della said because of capitalism. So, so a lot of the agencies that were created around that time were created by Roosevelt's executive orders, and then the Senate, and then the Congress would catch up and pass legislation that would authorize these various things. And so um, there was a law that was passed that restricted the government from basically stacking the deck as a commodities trader or broker. And so that was when the consolidation of a couple of these different smaller agencies eventually became the ag marketing service. Some of them became the CCC. Like there are different, there are a lot of different USDA agencies that were created in this time period. But to answer the question about the nutrition programs, was that there was a specific piece of legislation that was passed to the Commodity Exchange Act, and regulations were passed to make sure that the government didn't create unfair conditions through the nutrition programs. But really, really great question. Okay, let me share the screen again. Okay, so this one, sometimes I feel like these stories are stories that every single person knows. And then I have conversations with people who aren't federal ag law nerds and realize that some of these gems are not mainstream. But I'm pretty sure that a lot of people know this one. So I'll spend a little bit less time on this one. Um, but the school breakfast programs that we all have for now in public schools for now, um, partially was motivated by efforts of the Black Panthers. So the Black Panthers had multiple programs that were addressing the fundamental needs of the people in their communities. They had clothing giveaways, ambulance services, free health clinics, free shoes, and the longest standing legacy, or the one that I think most people can like readily identify as a program that was incubated by the Black Panthers, is the school breakfast program. And I really, really love this quote from Huey Newton. He said, all these programs satisfy the deep needs of the community, but are not solutions to our problems. That is why we call them survival programs, meaning survival pending revolution. I mean, survival pending revolution? It just makes me want to get up and run around. Like, yeah, like when I was in college and I first started learning about the Black Panthers, I was like, I'm a Black Panther now. And then I met Bobby Seale and I was like, maybe not, because they did many things to Bobby. And then I met Angela Davis and I was like, okay, maybe I do want to be one. But suffice it to say that what the Black Panthers were doing was starting from the question of what do our people need, not what are we good at, what are we like networked, what's our educations. They were, many of them were like, you know, college graduate student or young adult aged people. And so a lot of what they had was theory, and and they realized really quickly what their people needed were these fundamental basic needs to be met. And it makes me really excited because there were similar efforts underway in lots of places around the world, many of which were inspired by the Black Panthers. Many of the Pan-Africanists, many of the Caribbean, many people from the global South that were in that 60s era, really trying to meet their community's needs, figure out what would be that like brand of socialism that wouldn't get you killed. They were students of the Black Panthers. And so I know that I feel very encouraged to know that even one of the icons, one of the people that I most admire, recognize that, you know, the programs that we're doing and what we might create in this moment right now might just be for survival pending revolution. And if Huey P. Newton can set that as the bar, like I feel like that really levels the pressure playing field for all of us. And then another thing is that, like Angela Davis said, like they got to the root of the community needs instead of asking, like, you know, how do we create the right advocacy strategy to get the federal government to create a school nutrition program? Like they were like, let's just get these babies fed. And they understood fundamentally that if they addressed these deep rooted needs, then that would give folks the opportunity to actually understand the education, the revolutionary thinking, the Black Power analysis and theoretical framework that they wanted to help bring into their communities as well. And so the brilliance of this was that it had a direct community impact and then a long lasting legislative legacy to follow after. And I will say that there were other movements, as I said, going back all the way to 1939, there were movements for food stamp programs. There were people that were trying to see how to make programs like this work. And I think that what the Panthers did was they piloted something without any government aid. They piloted a program that was so successful that the government really was going to look bad if it didn't figure out ways to catch up. And so another lesson I think that we learn is that having a really effective pilot that meets people's needs at the fundamental levels, you know, is always going to have a lasting impact on our community. And so whenever you're feeling that, you know, how are we going to win back the Supreme Court or the whatever Senate, all these different things, remember that we can start with survival pending revolution. And that feels like a really exciting thing to me. And I wanted to give us a little bit of time for discussion. I want to break us into groups, and maybe not, because this is, maybe we'll stay all together. No, there are enough people to break into groups. So, what are some of the survival programs we can seed or pilot pending a full formation of the new world? What are some of the survival programs we can seed now pending the full formation of the new world? Okay, I can't figure out how to do it. So that's okay. I'm just going to invite folks to share in the chat. Survival pending revolution. That's fine. That's going to be my new thing. Survival pending revolution. So let's just survive pending revolution. Some stuff into the chat. What are some programs? And I've heard tons of things on tour that folks are already doing. And I know that many of you are doing, you know, brilliant work in your respective communities to address the basic needs of the people that we care about. But I know that National Black Food and Justice Alliance is trying to help their members figure out like a susu situation. I know that there's people having convenings so that we can exchange skill shares and best practices. I know that there's folks, Jermaine and them have a grocery store. I know that Fountain Heights Farm is putting up the first grocery store in like 70 years or something in their community. So I know we're doing the things. So it would be really great if we could just start populating the chat with some of the things that we're doing. Maybe we just need to expand them, but some of the things that we're doing to survive pending the revolution. And as you all type those answers into the chat, I'm just going to walk us really quickly through next steps and the next session. So I did put, I know that Justin, Lena, Adama were putting links in the chat. Thank y'all so much. Like my team is the best. Like this was such a last minute thing that I asked them to do and I saw them populate in the chat. So thank you. This PowerPoint presentation and video will be available after, but all of the sources cited are here as links because you should definitely fact check people who are telling you stories about laws and things. So you can feel free to fact check me, ask me about any of these readings when you get around to them. And then if you want to further nerd out, if that wasn't enough nerding for you, these are some additional resources that you can read to further be inspired this Black August about the connections between our movements. And the book Food, Power, Politics is like a very deep dive into the Greenwood blockade story and other stories from the US South. So check those out if you want further reading on these topics. And then next steps, read the supplemental materials, really spend some time with your answers to the reflection and discussion questions, really spend some time introspecting, especially when you're feeling anxious about all of the things that need to be done, spending some time with yourself and remembering that you have the answers. You've inherited all of this wisdom through movement leaders that have come before you. And then the one challenge or invitation that I would put out to all of you as a next step is to consider ways of taking action towards those answers. So if you were like, I'm going to start a program where I'm helping the unhoused access showers through these mobile shower companies, like starting to figure out the work to do that and then sharing it with folks at WTF. Maybe folks would want to try something like that too. They just don't know where to get started. But just by starting the process and figuring out all of what it takes to do the work is something that we can all learn from together. And then a plug for the upcoming sessions on August 14th. I'll be joined by my good friend Jerry Hilt, and we will be talking about Afro-Indigenous food insecurity together. And I'm really excited that she's available for that chat. And then on August 21st, I'll be joined by Dr. Jazz of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, and then from Heal, Nichelle will be joining us, and we're going to be talking about policy. I haven't run this title completely by them yet, but I think that what's more radical than centering Black women in a new constitution? Basically, that's what I pitched in law school, and I didn't get kicked out, and I'm a licensed lawyer, so we're just going to go with that because all of these things that we're doing, we're just surviving pending revolution. If you'd like to contact me, the fastest way to contact me is to email the team at land-liberation.com. Also follow me at WTF Safety Net for updates, the registration links, sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already. And thank you all so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spending this time together reflecting on this history that we're the legacy of. I mean, like last WTF, I was inviting us to think about like we're the bridge between the ancestors and descendants. And a friend of mine shared this piece that she wrote. She's a death doula, and she just wrote a piece on being an eventual ancestor. And I just love that a lot. So I'm just grateful to you all for being fellow eventual ancestors of this movement and for learning together. And I hopefully will see you next time.